Welcome to this episode of Stories That Shape Us. My name is Joanna Daniel. Now, I spoke to this amazing young woman this weekend. She says, Auntie Joe, I've been listening to your podcast. And so I asked her, what do you think I should do for the next series? I've just finished a series on rejection. If you haven't listened to it, I started last week, Sunday, and ended yesterday. I'm inviting you to go and listen to that series. And she wanted me to do something around boundaries and relationships for young people. And I'm going to start that series next week. There's a reason why I'm changing how I promised that I would start it today, but there's something that's been on my heart all weekend because of a post I saw in a response to a post and led me to want to talk about this. Now, I believe that boundaries in teen relationship is really important. I know that I don't remember the percentage of you guys that listen to this podcast is in that category. And that's why we're including it in our conference on the 8th and the 9th of April in Swansea in Wales. Come see a man. You can find details about that on all of our social media pages. I'll put it in the show notes for this episode of the podcast so that you can register for the conference before it's too late. We have limited capacity. If you're abroad and you're listening to the podcast, you would like to attend the conference, also send me a message because we have provision for you as well. So this week, though, I want to talk about abuse. And I don't think I've done a series on the podcast yet about abuse over several days. And I want to talk about abuse, and I'm going to talk about different um, types of abuse. And I'm going to always connect culture and religion as I talk about abuse, because I believe those two really has a significant impact in how we see abuse and our response to abuse. And that's what led me to this series this week, because I've been mulling this over and I tried to comment several times, but I felt it wasn't the right time for me to comment. I didn't think I had my thoughts together. And as I was driving home today, at a long 5-hour drive, I started putting things together in my mind about my response. And I realized that my response wasn't going to be doing justice on a post. I decided to use my platform to do it, to talk to you about abuse. And I know that I might be speaking to the choir right now, but I believe that when we educate each other and ourselves around abuse, then we can know what it looks like, what are the things that victims go through, and some of the things that we can do. So I've been working with women who experience abuse for almost 20 years in different settings. I've supervised students who are training on placements in abuse settings, observed written reports for university for students in those settings, and have support women in different capacities. At present, the people that I work with mostly are Christian women who are in abusive relationships, abusive marriages. And that brings a different level of complexity, right? What I hear though, and the essence of what I got from this conversation was that sometimes there's a difficulty in what is a difficult marriage and what is abuse. And I think they're two completely different things. If we know what abuse is, when we listen to the stories around a difficult marriage, we'll know that that's just a difficult marriage. But when we know what abuse is, we will know that that's not a difficult marriage, that's abuse. An abusive marriage is also a difficult marriage, but a difficult marriage is not always abusive. And we need to know the distinction so that we can appropriately support victims who are experiencing abuse. Because sometimes we have a one band-aid of pray more, which brings a lot of shame for people when they come forward. And so they don't proceed because there's so much shame around it, because we just want them to do better, pray more. And it's not always that simple. So I want you to know that at the heart of abuse is power and control. Who has power and control? Now, in many societies, men, I know you get abused too, but largely, the largest percentage of victims are females, right? So I want us to hear that in that context as well. Whoever you are as a victim, you need support, but I want us to know that from the beginning. So there are different types of abuse. There's physical violence, and sometimes we can readily see that. And even then, when a woman has been beaten, the perpetrator might say, well, she did this and she did that and she hit me too. And we see that as stop eating each other and not as an abusive marriage or an abusive relationship. There is sexual violence within a relationship too, that's abuse. There is financial abuse. Who has control of the money? I want to say something about this, because even if the woman is the one that's working and the man goes, well, you control the money and you're financially abusing me. But if you're able-bodied and you're not working and you're choosing to not work, and then you are expecting to be looked after, it's not financial abuse. So, that needs to be looked at and be honest. Have this honest conversation with yourself to go, what exactly is happening here, and why am I dependent when I don't need to be, right? There's also spiritual abuse and emotional abuse. And I want to say that when the spiritual abuse is part of the wider abuse, then it becomes really difficult. Now, of course, there are many other kinds of abuse, right? So I'm going to just talk through these this week. And I'm going to always weave the cultural abuse and the spiritual one throughout. So abuse is about power and control. So here is what's happening. In some cultures give men absolute control. And women are almost playing a supportive role in a relationship. I saw lots of conversation happens on social media that I'll probably talk about here, where one person said that, why do you, basically, I'm paraphrasing, why do you want a washing machine? Because back in the day, a woman used to look after her husband by hand washing, ask the elders. Um, and so that's interesting. Like, in a day and age where it's easily accessible, it's available, it's kind of like, show your love by washing with your hands and not a machine. Like, okay, as if she probably works, she must wash with her hands, look after the children, make sure dinner is ready, do all the things, and be nice and fresh when he returns from work. And that's not even possible because we're humans and there's not enough hours in the day and you get tired, and a host of other things. But that's another conversation. So when men have absolute control, women are playing a supportive role, and sometimes culture can play a role in ending the abuse or carrying it on. For example, access to resources to get help. Sometimes there are barriers for some women to get in support in different ways. So you have to think about, what are the barriers that a woman have in accessing support, in accessing help for abuse? What are those barriers in some cultures? Because men are given absolute control, the barrier might be there's nothing available. There are no support services available. There's nobody that will listen in context and hear the cycle and the dynamics and the pattern in the relationship to identify that this is harm and support women. So that might not be something that's within in the structure of society. And so it's so widespread that there is, though a woman might know that what she's experiencing is not right and it's not okay, she might not have anywhere to go with it because there are barriers to access. And if you take that woman and put her in a different society, like in the UK, there might be still barriers within the community for accessing support. There might be barriers within the church that prevents access to support because of the language that is used, because of how she's told about her role and what that role is and who she should be. And therefore, accessing support is, there's a lot of shame around accessing support, a lot of fear around accessing support. This might be seen as dishonoring and humiliating and shaming to her husband. Do not talk about what happens in your family. Don't talk about your husband. Keep the circle closed. This is the circle that nothing that happens in this circle must go outside of the circle. And therefore, you must keep everything here, be the burying ground for everything that your husband does, and don't share. So there's a lot of shame sometimes for women when she has to share, when it is too much, when she cannot cope and she needs help. There might be a lot of fear and shame around dishonoring her husband, dishonoring herself. When she shares, depending on where she shares, and that information is not treated confidentially, or the allegation is mishandled, then that shame becomes compounded. There's also a fear of dishonoring her family, dishonoring the family name. And here's another thing women struggle with which is cultural and sometimes religious, is not being strong enough, not being strong enough, not being woman enough, not being submissive enough. If you were strong enough, faithful enough, woman enough, then you wouldn't be going through this. So there's a lot of victim blaming in this sense that prevents access and prevents women from accessing support and getting help. There might be shame on the family, the sacred circle that you're breaking by disclosing abuse and sharing. And here's another thing that I know women are shamed. Women who have experienced childhood trauma and is in an abusive relationship, sometimes her trauma is blamed, because when people come who don't understand abuse and is listening, they'll say, well, I think that's your trauma. I believe people know when they're being mistreated. I believe somebody can know when they're taken advantage of. I believe somebody can know when they're physically abusive, when they're in a cycle of manipulation and control and harm. I believe people will know that. So it's really important that we learn how to listen. Sometimes the comeback is be patient and pray. Fast longer, pray some more. And this is sometimes when the people that are listening don't know the difference between an abusive marriage and a difficult marriage. They are very different. So if you're in leadership and you're listening to this, it's really important to understand what a difficult marriage is versus what abuse is, so you can know how to support people who have experienced abuse, and not put everything under the umbrella of a difficult marriage and send somebody home to do more. Because by the time she tells you, she would have done everything possible to stop it, and it's still not stopping. So and sometimes these things stop women from coming forward and accessing support. And also perpetrators use these things to silence victims, to keep them submitted to the harm and keep them from accessing support. So they'll use the narrative in culture, they'll use the narrative in their religious settings, to use that to shame women in silence, to shame her from not going forward. And so they'll use, sometimes they use these things to shame. If you are listening to a woman who is disclosing abuse, learn and understand, as I said, the cycle of abuse, learn and understand patterns of control and manipulation, learn and understand what abuse sounds like so you can hear the pattern in what is said. Because if you know how to listen, if you understand abuse, you will hear it in the story. So it's not somebody just saying, I have been abused. You will hear it in the story. And sometimes you'll be listening to a woman because of her culture and the structure within her culture. She might not know that that's what it is, but because you are trained and you're listening, then you will know that this is what it is, and you can support her accordingly. You can help her to access resources. You can help her to face those barriers so she's not facing them alone. And you can help her to overcome and to get to places of safety, which is sometimes necessary, and to get access to resources so she can help herself. Sometimes this is life or death. So it's really important that we understand the difference between a difficult marriage and an abusive one, and that we don't use the Bible and we don't use Christian literature to keep women who are in abusive relationship, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, spiritual, or sometimes all of the above, keep women in sending them home to pray some more, to fast, and to depend on God and to be patient. We really need to know the difference so we can help keep victims safe. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.